Excellent. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a very good lunch, and that despite this notoriously being called the graveyard slot, we're going to do everything we can to keep you awake and stop you falling asleep. My name is Jeremy Silver. I am the CEO of the Digital Catapult. The Digital Catapult is a business accelerator. It's part of a network of catapults funded by Innovate UK. We work with companies large and small. In our case, the digital case, we help companies who are innovating in the space grow faster and to develop their new markets for them. And we'll help larger companies and incumbent businesses get the most out of what digital technology has to offer and help them in digital transformation. We work in a whole range of fields, from data-driven businesses and covering areas like cybersecurity and blockchain, through to areas like future networks and the Internet of Things that we're going to talk about today. In there, we've been working extensively both on the 5G side of things, but also developing an experimental network for low-powered wide area networks, which we see as a real enabler of the Internet of Things, and very interesting applications emerging from that. And I think Caroline is going to probably talk a bit more about that later on, so I won't say too much about that now. Other areas that Digital Catapult works in are AI, machine learning, and also virtual reality and augmented reality. So all the most hyped technologies you can think of, we try and spend some time debunking the myths and actually putting them to work for businesses. So we've heard a lot today, so far this morning, about the threats represented both by and to the Internet of Things. I hope this afternoon we're going to switch tacks a little bit and talk more about the opportunities, and now that we've understood the full extent of what the threats might actually be. In that context, I think the Internet of Things is absolutely out there. The number of devices is said to be due to double in the next 3 or 4 years. We're seeing lower levels of investment in IoT, and that's perhaps something that the panel might like to discuss during the course of the day. And yet we're seeing all sorts of industries really putting it to work straight away. Caterpillar, for example, using predictive data analytics to find out when their machinery needs to be maintained in advance of them failing on site. And yet, at the same time, we know that there's still lots and lots of opportunity for manufacturing industries. And so understanding where those opportunities are and seeing what we might do to accelerate them, I hope, is going to be the topic of our discussion this afternoon. We've got 4 fantastic and highly qualified speakers to intrigue you and stimulate you. And to start with, we're going to hear from Mike Short. Mike Short is currently with Telefonica. He has worked in electronics and telecommunications, believe it or not, for 40 years. It's hard to believe that, Mike. Really, I'm not sure that I believe that. It says it here, but I'm not sure if I believe that at all. And he says that he's had experience with 5 generations of mobile technology and mobile data services. So there's a huge amount to learn. Mike was instrumental in setting up the 5G Innovation Centre at Surrey University. He's been involved in a range of mobile licensing bids and in recent years working in innovation for business development in areas as diverse as mobile TV, connected cars, smart metering, smart cities, and emergency services. So very interested to hear what you have to say. Mike Short, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. As you may gather from the slide, I'm going to cover a little bit of the smart home story as well as some of the areas to do with wellness. But before I start, O2 is owned by Telefonica. We have around 27 million customers, but Telefonica is in about 27 countries. So I thought I'd give an international flavour to this IoT story and then bring out some of the key domains we see as growth opportunities, and then perhaps just touch on the role of the Internet in the Internet of Things to sort of bring it to a conclusion. Some of you may remember your first mobile phone. First mobile phone call was made in about 1973, but in the UK, services launched in 1985. So we've had close to 32 years of services. Cellnet became O2 eventually, and that's the company I work for today. You may notice the shape and size and brands of those phones have changed a lot, but another way that Business Week looked at it was smaller is good, larger is good. Now, the screens have got bigger for a range of reasons. Most of the latter end of that picture are looking at the Internet. So the mobile earlier generations did not access the Internet, whereas the more recent generations certainly do. What that does not convey is some of the issues to do with coverage or photography or messaging or email, but the bigger screens have helped with the photography and emails and messaging. What we also don't see on that screen are the things that we're now connecting. And I can actually say that we're probably connecting in the last 2 years more things in Western Europe than we're connecting people. And on a cellular way of thinking about things, that's quite important. How do we connect things beyond the smartphones? How do we consider the impact of connected things when they're not always mobile? They may be stationary, but they may be using a mobile network. How do we consider them when they use combinations of Wi-Fi, cellular, and in some cases satellite? And as we get into 5G, next generation mobile, we'll need to think about combinations of networks. So I'm mainly going to cover mobile today, but it's the smartphone revolution that's opened up the internet. If we take the customer numbers globally, I used to be chairman of the Global GSM Association, headquartered here in London, some 20 years ago, and then on the board for 8 years. Their numbers published in February this year for the end of last year, 4.8 billion unique subscribers, likely to rise to 5.7. That's before we include the things. So this is people. On the right-hand side, it shows the unique SIM cards or smart cards inside mobile devices. Again, 9.7 billion is the projection. So left is unique subscribers. On the right-hand side is more than one device per person. But the smartphone growth is not the only growth story. The other big growth story is the Internet of Things in the world that we're in. This just shows for your reference the smartphone sort of growth. The left-hand side is the smartphone installed base globally, and only close to 2.8 billion smartphones in use at the end of last year. Now, this country happens to have closer to 85% smartphone penetration in the UK, but globally, not all those subscriptions on the earlier slide are yet with smartphones, many of them with feature phones. But what we also see is the internet connectivity is being led by mobile. Mobile access to the internet is the lead device to access the internet today. It may not be the lead traffic generator or usage generator of the internet, but it's certainly the lead access point today. So when we look at that as a backdrop of statistics, where are the opportunities for the Internet of Things as we connect things? So we tend to think about the home, as in smarter homes, more connected devices in the home, maybe the vehicle or the car, connected cars, and the city or smart city. And we can see examples in all three of those domains. Clearly there will be examples between those domains, so in open public spaces, on railway lines, on roads, but let's just think about those three domains of the home. So in the home, we might think about healthcare or assisted living. How do we get devices that might be in that wearables category which could help predict a condition before you need to go to hospital? It may help you with prevention of illness if you have things like diabetic monitors or blood pressure sensors. How do these health devices, which in some cases could be wearable, connect to your clinician, your specialist advisor, possibly with the internet in mind? So the Internet of Things is touching the home in health. But it's also touching the home in terms of energy. So think about energy and how would your energy be measured, perhaps to give you alert services to better pricing offers, or maybe to off-peak plans, maybe even alarms of security in the home. How would that alert you to a particular problem in the home? That's all in addition to some of the maintenance areas that people are talking about. So it's not just connected lawnmowers or connected cameras, it's things in the home, and we're seeing some examples of these today. If we take the market projections, we can see the wearables market projected to be something like 30 billion. Not all connected via cellular, some being connected via Wi-Fi, some being connected by short-range radio. It's a big market for that wearables side. But if we just think a little bit about the car, why doesn't the car have some health wearables, health sensors in it, so that we can actually help with safer driving? Why doesn't the steering wheel have some alerts to make sure that people who are a little unsafe at the wheel could have alert mechanisms, not to wake them up, but maybe to alert different people? Why doesn't the car have better breakdown services, as is coming into the connected car market? We're expecting to see e-call connectivity for every car next year, every new car for next year. And certainly within 8 to 10 years, we could see most cars, if not all cars, being connected by 2025. That starts to open up lots of navigation options for real-time navigation to avoid accidents and traffic jams. It starts to open up energy management systems for the car. Might also help with pro-safety, pro-innovation measures as well. We can start to see connected cars. Now, as O2, I know we've been connecting cars in the M2M or machine-to-machine world since 1987. So we've had 30 years' experience of this. IoT brings another dimension, but actually it's not new. We've been doing a lot of this for a long time. And as we add more capability and connectivity, we'll see more capability go to the driver and to the people who are the transport users. The last one, the city. The city is a very important area which is not well instrumented today. If we think about how do you control lighting systems, how do you control traffic in a congested city, how do you handle the energy in a city, some of those dashboards are not really as good as IoT can make them. So there are many opportunities in the smart city area to try and manage cities better, to reduce congestion, to improve and measure the environment, and to improve and manage the traffic. I'm very proud that the GSM Association, that as I was chairman of, has signed up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The mobile industry is the first sector to have signed up to all the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. I don't have time to go through all of them today. The very obvious ones, sustainable cities and communities, number 11, clearly the smart city example plays into that. Areas like infrastructure are fairly obvious as well. But actually there are examples where we're measuring water. We're measuring the provenance of food to reduce hunger. We're measuring areas to do with the environment to improve air quality. We're doing certain things to do with gender equality, with things like mobile money transfer and empowered women in villages around the world. I'm very proud also that the UK aid agency, DFID, have worked with the GSM Association on case studies and trials in Africa as part of their UK aid programme, and that fits very well to this. So within the limited time I have available, I don't have time to go through all of those, but it's an international world where there are lots of references. I would suggest if you're a researcher, you look at the Ofcom Annual Communications Market Report, CMR 2017, or the Annual International Communications Market Report, which compares 16 countries every year. Similarly, the GSM Association I've referred to has several studies, so Sustainable Development Goals, I can show it to people afterwards if they wish, or Global Mobile Trends if you want to understand the role of IoT in that. But broadly, there are a lot of references out there. There are a couple of other references there to do with white papers on 5G if you need them, and the impact that will bring for more capacity for IoT. And lastly, the Kliners-Perkins Mary Meeker report at the bottom, which talks about the future internet in a very interesting way from a new business model's point of view. And if you need more, ETSI, the European Telecom Standards Institute, have an event in October, a week on IoT, looking at the different technologies of IoT, not just cellular, but also some of the areas to do with security, and that's 23rd to the 26th of October. Thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike. Some really good food for thought there about some areas of opportunity that we haven't heard that much about yet today. So, moving on, our next speaker graduated from Princeton and her first job was at Google. And from there, she moved in 2008 to Facebook, who recruited her to join right at the beginning of their organization's life. In 2011, she moved across to the UK and founded the Politics and Government division of Facebook, which I think is probably becoming more and more relevant every week, and moved to the UK and to London in 2011. Today, Elizabeth Linder advises leaders at the senior-most levels of governments and corporations in 40 countries around the world. She founded something called the Conversational Century, which is helping to redefine conversation at the global level against the backdrop of her experience at Facebook. And she is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House, where she leads the Connectivity Initiative. So, Elizabeth, the stage is yours. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, you asked us to consider optimism. And as a native Californian, that is exactly what we do. So I'm definitely going to hopefully hit on some areas that I'm really excited about in this space, while also alerting us to some areas that I think are really interesting patterns that are starting to change. Yes, the Politics and Government division, I spent 8 years at Facebook, and most of that was building the Politics and Government division. So as usual, my day started this morning by doing some commentary on Amber Rudd's latest comments on how it is that she feels that tech companies are not doing quite enough to combat the issues that this country faces today in that case on extremism and terrorism. So it's a fascinating field to be in. But shifting over to our topic at hand this afternoon, I really wanted to focus my opening remarks on two key areas. The first is product development, as seen through the lens of the tech companies that I know best, Google, YouTube, and Facebook, and how it is that the Silicon Valley ethos has typically thought about product development and where I see that starting to shift. Some of you might remember in the early days of Facebook, there was only the opportunity to have one photo on your Facebook profile. That was your profile picture, and it was meant to represent you in a similar way that an entry in a book would represent you. And what started to happen in the early days of the company is we started to notice that when people were coming back from holidays or were changing jobs or moving home, they were starting to update their profile picture with multiple different photos, one a day, maybe two a day. And the team of engineers at Facebook looked at this behavior and said, well, wait, this isn't what this little profile picture slot was meant to be. This is meant to be one picture representing you, but maybe people actually want to use a service like Facebook to share photos. That's a really interesting idea we hadn't thought of before. And from that was born the photo sharing app. Facebook, of course, now is the #1 destination for sharing photos around the world. And it's natural for us now that we think of Facebook as a place where you upload a photo album and share many photos with your friends. But it didn't start out that way. And my point is that this is how the Silicon Valley has typically ticked. They look at how millions of people misuse certain elements of their products to understand how people want to use them. And actually, I would go so far as to say that from a Silicon Valley perspective, these companies don't like preaching to people about how their products should be used. They don't like meddling in people's affairs and saying, well, this is how you should use it. It's the other way around. They build something, they think it's great, they get super excited about it, they get investors to come in. And then people start using it in a way that nobody anticipated, and they're like, boom, that's the business opportunity. Let's hire a bunch more engineers and go down that track. So it's millions of people around the world that tend to drive the middle and end state of these products. I remember one particular presentation at Google. Some of you might remember Google Wave. It was a product that lasted for literally, I think, a few months. But a group of engineers presented this thing, and all of us on the communications team gathered in the conference room at the end of the presentation and said, well, wait, what exactly is this supposed to do? And they realized that if a bunch of communicators couldn't figure out how to communicate what the heck the product did, potentially it would not get adopted by all of Google's users around the world. What I'm starting to see shift, however, and this is where I'm going to start moving a little bit from the consumer perspective, the people perspective, into the regulatory and policy space, is increasingly policymakers, academics, think tanks, are asking the companies to be more suggestive, more predictive in how they ask people to use their products. Rather than leave it up to share whatever the heck you want to share on Facebook, how does Facebook start to editorialize what kinds of information people should be reading versus what kinds of information is potentially fake or misleading news? This is a whole different space that these companies are not really accustomed to dealing with. Because typically the point of freedom of expression is we might not agree with what you say, but you're allowed to say it. If it's not illegal, you can use our services to whatever end you choose, rather than us telling you how you should use them. And so we're getting into this kind of strange space of product development, which I think is going to be really important to the future of where the so-called Internet of Things takes us, because it's going to be a space that, because of the safety, because of the security issues, because of the question as to who has ultimate responsibility as data travels from car to home to fitness center, treadmill, there's going to be increased scrutiny as to saying, well, no, you actually have to tell people how it is that this is properly used. And this is a space that I think fundamentally most tech companies are not excited about and not really willing to embrace. There's a huge tension going on, I would say, between the ways in which seamless products in the tech sector work from a consumer perspective and the way that the regulatory or policy-making community wants to see them work. Most policymakers would absolutely love it if everything you did on the internet you explicitly agreed, you explicitly gave permission, you reviewed your safety settings every time. Consumers, in my experience, absolutely hate that, and therefore tech companies hate that. They want to see the most seamless integration possible. Don't show me everything your engineers are futzing around with on the back end. Just show me that perfect experience. I want to get in my car. I want my Spotify to play to my favorite soundtrack as I'm driving down this highway. I want to get on my treadmill. I don't want to do anything. Just show me my heart rate where it is, where it should be, what all of the world's personal trainers would suggest I do right now. Make it easy, make it seamless, make it smooth. Tech companies work really hard to mask how difficult their products are to engineer on the back end in order to create those experiences. California overuses the word delight in all of their product briefings because what they want to do is surprise the user with how easy it is. And yet, as all of these services get more and more integrated against different companies, against different countries and platforms, the more you have the regulators of the world, the policymakers of the world say, you know, this might not look as good, it might not be as easy to use, but we're going to insist that you put in bits and pieces of friction between products people are using in order to ensure that we keep our country and our society safe. There we go. Thank you.
Excellent. So a very different take there, but really great to get the Silicon Valley insight into the equation. Our next speaker is going to reach back into some of the conversations that we had earlier this morning and draw the connections, perhaps. Maybe she won't. We'll see. But it's quite possible that our next speaker, given her background as former head of the UK Police Cybercrime and senior cybercrime advisor to PwC, Charlie McMurdie has spent 32 years in law enforcement one way or another. She established a world-class national cybercrime capabilities to help us as a country in the 2012 Olympics. And in doing that, she delivered, it says here, over £1.8 billion of harm prevention. So it might be that Charlie will explain to us what £1.8 billion worth of harm prevention means. Charlie McMurdie, welcome.
I wasn't aware that I was going to be talking about any of that, but I can make it up as I go along. I'm used to doing that as an ex-cop. So I'm kind of here wearing two hats. Forget that pun. We are Chatham House, aren't we? Two hats. My law enforcement, ex-law enforcement hat, as you've heard, head of cyber, and also my PwC hat, where I've spent 4 years within PwC, helping them build out their cyber capability, so doing the internal piece as well as the external, going out to clients when it all hits the fan and major breaches happen, but hopefully before it hits the fan, helping them actually build their resilience and defences. So a bit first about the law enforcement side of things. I've been warned to be upbeat and positive rather than all doom and gloom, and we're all going to get hacked. And they're going to bring all our infrastructure down. They will, but there you go. So 32 years law enforcement, dealing with lots of really nice types of crime. You know, the good old-fashioned, that's my old flying squad team, dealing with armed robberies. You know, the guys across the pavement with the guns. Policing was so simple then. You had one physical location, you had the bad guys, you had your forensics. It was all there contained in one nice scene. Now with cyber and IoT, it's everywhere, and we don't know where it is or where they came in or when they came in. So lots of different challenges have suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Policing challenges, talk about the people. We've heard a lot this morning about you know, the technology and the policy and the standards and all these different component aspects of IoT. But we haven't actually really gone into, and something that I tend to focus on, but I haven't done here, is the people either end. IoT is a great enabler. You know, we can automate things, we can be innovative, but at the end of the day, we have people that have to deploy it, build it, people like cops who have to respond to it when it's actually compromised or used for attack purposes. And we have people at the other end that are actually using it to commit their crime, that see it as an opportunity. There's all these little bits stuck on that infrastructure now that they can use as a way in and cause harm. So thinking about the people at the front end dealing with it when it all goes horribly wrong, the cops, most of these guys there, you know, if you said that they would now be dealing with the internet robberies that take place, you know, stealing millions and billions, the Russians that are stealing money out of our organisations, rather than, you know, the guys with the guns, they'd run a mile. They wouldn't know what you're talking about. That's going back Life on Mars days, 1980s. Unfortunately, the picture around cops and capability, and I might get shot down around some of this, hasn't really changed that much since I set up the National Police cybercrime capability. We still have, within policing, generally policing, lower numbers, lower budget, lower resources, greater priorities. We've seen, you know, in the news, other demands that are placed on policing now. But the actual number of police officers trained who have that high-end capability and understanding, some of the presentations this morning, you know, that their brains would explode if you said, right, go out and look at the security aspects of those, or deal with the breaches when they take place around some of that infrastructure that we've been talking about. So big challenge around who's going to provide responses to things as and when they happen. My next challenge is how to click forwards. I always go back. Do it on that. So very quickly, more on the sort of opportunities that I had within PwC. So going from cyber in law enforcement, it was very much the stuff that industry told you about, chose to tell you about, breaches that hit the fan that we became aware of. Within PwC, you get to see far more are under that sort of confidential banner of what's actually going on in the world. Some of the stats PwC has compiled on behalf of governments around what's actually happening in cybercrime. And I won't go into, you know, specific numbers because they all have a general theme. What is happening on the internet out there? What's going on? Well, internet crime is becoming far more sophisticated. It's not the ram raiders that charge into our infrastructure, steal what they can get hold of and run away again. It's not, you know, your armed robbers. They're far more sophisticated. They want to infiltrate way into your organisation. Quite often they'll come in through IoT or, you know, way down the supply chain to work their way into your organisation, undetected, unbeknownst to you. They'll look at open source intelligence to wheedle their way in, or, you know, use scams or physical devices. Longer discovery time, well, that ties in, and we've seen, you know, recent news stories about, Equifax or Yahoo or whatever the latest breach is, hits the fan. Well, yeah, but it happened 12 months ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, because they've lost sight of what's going on within their network. They don't know what's on their network. They don't know where it happened. They weren't watching that weak link that might have been, you know, somewhere in some foreign country, somewhere along the lines. Top target in Europe, that's the UK. I think, pinch of salt, stats, this is a bit of good news maybe, rather than doom and gloom. Yeah, we are a great target, and speak to any cyber criminal, they love to target the UK. They love to operate in the UK, and they love to spend their ill-gotten gains in the UK. Most of them go shopping down in Harrods. Stop every 10th person, they're probably a cyber criminal spending their ill-gotten gains. They all go to Harrods. If you're, you know, making millions out of cybercrime, you don't want to live in the back and beyond of somewhere, come over to the UK, it's great. But they also love UK banks. If you're moving millions of stolen currency around, UK banks, really fast, really slick, really effective. So they love UK banks as well. But I say pinch of salt, we are pretty good at talking about what's going on in the UK. Today is a testament. We all get together, we share intelligence, we share information. We've got fairly good reporting infrastructure, intelligence sharing infrastructure, so we're quite sighted on the problems that take place. Human failures, every breach, there is a human aspect. Either a sleeper deployed in that organisation. How many sleepers have we got in here with fake profiles, fake legends, just getting an ear to what's going on, what's the good guys doing, so they can use it for nefarious purposes. And we've seen, you know, sleepers in financial institutions, legal institutions, gained employment, completely fake profiles, been there for a couple of years, just, you know, seeding out to the criminal fraternity. But more so, you know, the individual who doesn't follow the policy or sticks in that thumb drive that they found lying around that's got some bug on it and puts it into the infrastructure. So an insider aspect. Cyber incident plan, Robert mentioned that earlier this morning. You know, businesses, they might have thought about cyber nowadays. You know, they are far more cited, boards far more aware. You know, we have a plan. When did you test it? Well, the techie team might know about that. Well, if you don't know it's been tested, then it hasn't been tested. And everybody needs to play their part within cyber. The flavours, general, this is familiar to everyone. The most common stuff that we see going on, and this is relevant to IoT because most of these, you know, they'll look, we've already heard IoT being used for DDoS. UK is one of the top targets, so's Japan, so's America. Most of that is using infrastructure that emanates back from Russia and Korea. Is the infrastructure that's being used, not necessarily those responsible for the attacks, but they like to use that infrastructure because it's hard to reach for law enforcement. We can't go there or do anything about it, so they think. Scams, won't talk about that. Just one on stock prices that I've put up there. You know, manipulation of the integrity of data and looking at how that integrity runs through. Oh, running late. I always go on rambling too long. Ransomware, goes without saying, is everywhere, is easy to deploy. You can get a ransomware kit, stick it on there, no problems. So Internet things, this is the sort of thing, you know, police officers have to deal with. The guys at PwC, they love this sort of stuff. We've already heard about the killer kettle. We used to do the killer toaster. And you can activate that, you know, the malware that's on the internet-enabled toaster, use sonic sound waves, or you can use light beams now. So, you know, some of these challenges are phenomenal. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, all these connected devices, they are an opportunity. I was saying to Jeremy earlier, you know, one of the big demands now we get from clients in industry is they want to know, what have they got in place? What security has our next door neighbours got in place? Because we want to do business and we want to say that we've got better security, better data protection, better process in place than our neighbours. So business development opportunities. And a lot of that is about understanding their network, who's on their network, who's got what permissions, you know, just mapping out. And we've seen news stories. This was last week. You know, one of the CISOs within the health sector thought he had about 30,000 connected devices on his network, actually ran a program, identified there was around 70,000. So, you know, just thinking about organisations, IoT, who is plugging what into your network? Do you know when something else is plugged in? Do you understand how that thing that's plugged in could be used or the harm it potentially could cause? Not saying don't do it, you know, don't have internet-enabled heart-pulping monitor things. Just understand, and for every device, think about what is the risk. There is an opportunity with every device, but there is also a risk. And that, the last one there is, again, reiterating about, you know, thinking about the risks, thinking about how things could be utilised to cause harm, and being prepared for it. So I think I've run over. I won't go on to... I was going to say all the good messages and all the good work that's being done within industry, which is what I was told to talk about, but perhaps I can cover that with some questions later. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think there's a huge amount of food for thought there, and obviously more to discuss and more that we'll get onto in the panel discussion. So our final speaker used to be a member of my team until Friday, and she it wasn't because she heard she was speaking at this conference, honestly. Caroline has been the head of IoT at Catapult for the last 3 years, I think, or 2 years, something like that. And before that worked at Telefonica and has worked in various consulting capacities. She, on Monday, started as head of partnerships, digital partnerships? Partnerships for Rolls-Royce. So I like to think that occasionally we graduate brilliant people who work at the Catapult out into even more brilliant places, and Caroline's one of those people, so we're very glad to have her here today. Caroline.
Thank you very much indeed. One other fun fact, it is actually today my birthday. So I shall expect a rousing happy birthday at the end of the event, but let's not have it happening now. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk. 3 really thought-provoking presentations from my colleagues on the panel. I want to just spend a few minutes now thinking about the opportunities for the IoT, specifically in the context of the UK. As Jeremy has already outlined, of course, the Catapult is absolutely focused on how we can bring the transformational potential of digital technologies to businesses large and small across the UK economy. And that includes not only how we can help big incumbent businesses to use digital technology to transform the way that they operate, of which there are significant opportunities from the IoT. But it also includes how we can help support smaller technology businesses coming out of our academic base, but also coming out from venture capitalism and the generation of technology innovators, you know, as we would recognize from the words that Elizabeth gave us, who can then compete on a global scale, on a global platform. So if we think about that from the context of the UK, what do we actually know about how the IoT is evolving in the UK marketplace? What is it about this economy, about our space here on the global stage that differentiates us, or where we have strengths and opportunities? Well, the first thing to say is, and I think this is very obvious actually from the work that we heard reported this morning from multiple of the contributors, that the UK has a really strong leadership position in terms of the academic base leading in Internet of Things research. If we just looked at the Reed Elsevier Scopus database for 2015, which is when this research was done, then at that point we were ranked number 5 in the world for IoT research. And when I tell you that rankings number 1 and 2 fell to the USA and China, and actually 3, 4, and 5 were very, very tightly clustered together, 3 European nations tightly clustered together, that was the UK, Germany, and Italy at that time, we have a really strong position, and we've been building on that. The work that's been funded by the UK government in the IoT UK programme, which is about £60 million worth of investment, 30 million from the government and 30 million matched fund from industry, includes the support from EPSRC for Petrus, and that programme of academic research is you know, a significant contribution towards our understanding of what it means to be citizens, people and businesses living in an ever more connected world. And for me, I guess the challenge that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about some of these domain scale issues about security, about privacy, about ethics, is what does it really mean to be a digital human? And how do we get ourselves to the point where we really understand our position within a networked civilization? Because if we can't understand how it is we need to navigate and negotiate with that network civilization, it's very hard for our service providers, whether they be tech companies or whether they be governments or whether they be infrastructure providers or whether they be auto manufacturers or whoever it happens to be, it's hard for them to really take on board the responsibilities, the liabilities and the due diligence that they owe in creating those services and products for us. When we looked at how the UK market was evolving in 2015, the things that were really drawing attention from a research and academic focus were public funding spend on cybersecurity. I think we've clearly seen the evidence of a lot of that work here today, but also healthcare, privacy and trust, and transport. And it is absolutely in those domains which have that impact on our lives as digital citizens that we've seen an awful lot of the public sector investment going forwards. Interestingly, most private sector activity, very much echoed from some of the words that Mike gave us, was driven towards smart home. And increasingly, a lot of the venture capital spend that we were seeing happening in 2015 and early 2016 was also focused predominantly around smart home and smart buildings, because that's where the investment banking community saw the greatest possible return for their money in the immediate term. And they were particularly interested at that point in looking at the software application layer for IoT. And for me, that raises some interesting challenges, because I don't wish to be in any way disrespectful to the software engineering industry, and I know a lot of what they do is very hard work, but believe you me, it's nowhere near as hard as building hardware. The complexity of creating secured, well-provided hardware takes many, many more years of development work, and it's much more expensive than the rapid and agile development cycles that we have seen in the software business. And that's creating some interesting challenges, because as venture capital money goes into the software layer for IoT, the gaps that are left behind in venture capital supporting hardware development are creating a marketplace which we're filling with cheap hardware for which the right kinds of security provisions are not necessarily being added. And then the last challenge we have faced in the UK, but we're really addressing in the last 2 years since we did this work, is back in 2015, we made the challenge to both government and to business at the beginning of the IoT UK programme that the trickle-down funding from research spend, either from the public sector or from the venture capital base, was not optimum in terms of its distribution across the country. We saw an enormous predominant availability of funding focused around London and the South East, with a few pockets up in Glasgow, but we didn't see that spreading out across the rest of the country in the way we would wanted to have seen. I'm really pleased to say that when we redid this research at the beginning of this year, we saw far more percolation of that funding happening in other areas of the country. It's by no means perfect, but it is moving forwards. So we can see that that opportunity for the leadership that the UK can demonstrate, not least because it remains one of the most highly connected and consumer readiness states of any country in the G20, consistently ranked for e-commerce behaviours among the leaders in the G20. That opportunity that we have from the sheer advancedness of the digital humans who live in our country is absolutely ready to have the opportunity to take leadership on the global platform. So thank you very much.
Well, I think you've heard a really interesting range of topics and thoughts there. Questions? Ooh, lots of hands popping up. Okay. There are people with microphones around. So, gentleman right at the back on the aisle, and then a gentleman on the left in the middle here. And I'll do them sort of two at a time, see how we get on.
I'm Ross Draggers from the Royal Society. My question is about cybercrime. So as the IoT continues to grow, whose responsibility do you think it is to deal with cybercrime? So it's been mentioned that the police are possibly finding that overwhelming. Do you imagine that will stay with the police, or will it move elsewhere? Should it move elsewhere?
Okay, thank you. Good question. And the next question?
Yes, hi, great panel. I really enjoyed it. My name is Maziar Nekovi from University of Sussex and also previously Samsung. My question is about more sort of the business and revenue generation from IoT. One to the panel and also Mark Short and our other colleagues. I want to Caroline as well, but also involve other panels. Is one in terms of sort of a mobile operators? I mean, obviously one of the challenges is that with 4G and might be also 5G, that a lot of revenue is actually going to the over-the-top, such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, and so on. Just extrapolating to IoT, if all these great networks are in place, and I was just reading the Ericsson's latest mobility report, some interesting forecasts on IoT penetration. What are your thoughts as how the revenue is going to be divided up between the the future Facebooks, which are going to be the over-the-top for IoT devices, and the mobile operators who have to provide all this connectivity? Do you have any views on that? And the other was also very interested in what Caroline mentioned about the UK leadership in sort of this IoT space. And other things to come to mind is just the same as like the internet space, the role of user-generated content and sort of what you can cream up from IoT traffic connected to big data, analytics, and so on. Wouldn't that be maybe kind of a more promising area? And should we be a sort of a second mover, perhaps, even when it comes to, you know, the hardware side, and basically see what else everyone else is doing, and then monetize on this sort of areas? So just two questions.
Great. Okay, you got two questions for the price of one there, didn't you? Yes. What we'll do is we'll take the first one first, and then we'll come back to the business model question. And well, Charlie, that's probably one for you, isn't it, to start off with?
Who should deal with cybercrime? Everyone. Everyone has their part to play, and that's the problem. We don't accept that we all have a part to play in cybercrime. We always think it's, you know, those geeky, techie guys down in the basement. They deal with the cyber security of our organisation, our business. I think you were actually more alluding to the fact who provides that enforcement investigative capability when cyber happens. I've seen it from both sides, the capability, and as I mentioned briefly there, you know, law enforcement, even with our National Cybersecurity Centre, with GCHQ, with our regional cybercrime units, with the Falcon capability, which is the sort of amalgamated resource under the Metropolitan Police, with the National Crime Agency, we are still only talking about hundreds of officers with a remit of investigating, responding and preventing cybercrime. When we see the scale of cyber incidents, it's in the news this morning, there are two attacks per day that warrant multi-agency response. So that very high echelon type of attack occurring. There's thousands and thousands of cybercrimes taking place each and every day. There is more cybercrime happening than all other types of crime put together at the moment. That's recorded statistics. So who should deal with cybercrime? Something I would advocate is industry knows the infrastructure better. Industry sits on the infrastructure. Industry's built the infrastructure. Industry has far greater expertise, knowledge, far greater resources. They are the best placed people to deal with attacks and breaches when they happen within their own infrastructure. What we fail to do is then use, almost swear them in as deputies, use that response, that resource, that capability, and then bolt on top the law enforcement go and use their power of arrest, prosecution hat. Law enforcement will turn up if there's a big attack on the Royal Society today. We might, you know, do the forensics, do the investigation, identify where it's coming from, who's doing what, where, when. Law enforcement will walk in and start from scratch. They would have to do their own forensics. They would do their own investigation. So, you know, that accountability, the evidential trail, they would start from scratch. We can't carry on like that. Industry provides more investigative resources than law enforcement currently has. You look at the top four, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte, etc., EY, you know, they have massive hundreds, if not thousands, of staff that are trained to investigate, and, you know, they're the ones deploying cybersecurity measures. They can do investigations as well. I think what we need to do more is around using that expertise, their investigation of incidents, and bolt on the law enforcement aspect to it. They can retain staff. You can't retain. My biggest challenge when I was running cyber, you train up a member of staff, might take you 3 years, 4 years, might cost you 30, 40,000, put them through. As soon as they get their MSc in cyber, they jump ship, they go to Facebook, or they go to, you know, one of the banks, or they can pay better, they can get promotion in those types of organisations. You can't get promoted in law enforcement and stay in the same field of expertise is one of the challenges.
And Charlie, just sticking with you just for a second, and seamlessly linking those two questions together, what the business opportunity that you talked to, you mentioned earlier, the business opportunity in actually being more aware and having better cybersecurity as part of your business model?
Yeah, so I mentioned it earlier, you know, industry now is expecting certain standards, certain security measures to be in place. If you are going to provide me with a service or be in part of my supply chain, I don't want to put you onto my network unless I know, I use the phrase fit for purpose. And we're seeing more companies now actually saying, right, I want you to make sure, put these measures in place, test my security, give me certificates that say, I've got A, B, C, and D in place, because I want to shout about that, because that will get me more business than my competitors who haven't got that in place. I think there's far more that we could be doing around, audits of companies. I do a lot with, private equity. If you're taking over, if you're buying a company, companies want to actually demonstrate, not just that they produce the best widgets on the market, but also that their intellectual property is safe, secure, their R&D is safe and secure, that, they've got a going concern. They're not going to fall over and go bust because they're going to suffer a breach, or a breach will be identified next week that transpires that all that R&D is actually compromised material, or they can't prove the integrity of that material. So it is really, I think we've moved from, that ignorance and boards not understanding that cyber stuff. Now boards, when you speak to chief execs, I think, cyber is very much on the agenda. And it's very much not just what's the risk, what's our cyber appetite and cyber risk. It's we can actually use this for a competitive advantage.
Brilliant, brilliant. And Mike, other business models then, and UGC possibly?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier on with the Internet of Things, having been involved with machine-to-machine for over 20 years, but what the Internet brings is certain functions, and it's quite important to understand those functions first. So data storage, you might put that on the Internet in the cloud. Provisioning, how you might provision the things from the Internet through to the connectivity needed, different security levels. You might also include certain services or maintenance contracts or maintenance updates. You might include certain alerts and prevention techniques. You might include some added value security, whether it be encryption or otherwise. So the role of the Internet can add more value beyond the traditional machine-to-machine market. So from an operator point of view, we could do any of those, but we're not suggesting we do them all with cellular or all with Wi-Fi. They could be done with a variety of communications channels. Some customers prefer to use a specialist in their sector for it. So you might say for a city, there may be a specialist Internet of Things aggregator, or for a home, there may be a specialist health provider for the home with a dashboard. You could imagine different specialists. There is plenty of room in this growing market for lots of players. But if the connectivity is cellular, the things that we would do is to provide the connectivity in some cases, is to provide the management services or hosting in some cases, is to provide some of the sale of the thing and the customer care that would go with the thing. Perhaps also we would add some trust because we're a regulated entity and some over-the-top players are not regulated. That may bring trust with it. So all of those have value, but it's got to be driven, I think, by the market and the choice the customer faces and us competing in that market. And just to conclude, I think whether it's the home, the car or the city, we're doing some in all of those today, and we will do some in all of those 3 in years to come.
Excellent. Caroline?
Yes, just one quick thought about that question of what the value of the services that might be delivered or unlocked by the IoT are. I'm sure many of you will have come across McKinsey's report looking at the potential $4 to $11.3 trillion of value that they assess could be generated by the IoT and by services and applications run over the IoT by 2025. We did a piece of work at the Digital Catapult. That number is a global number, and McKinsey don't break it out by individual countries. But we did a piece of work looking at the forecast for the G20 economy share from the Carnegie Institute and applied that to McKinsey's model. And actually it output a value for the UK market of between $100 and $300 billion by 2025 being generated by IoT services. The bulk of that value actually comes in one of two categories. It either comes in additional consumer spend potential that arrives from new services being developed which perhaps have never previously existed, which consumers are prepared to pay for. And then the second area where the significant element of that spend or that value is sitting in is in efficiency gains being delivered to incumbent or existing operating businesses from being able to run their processes more effectively. And if I just give you one really clear example, if you look at the categories from the McKinsey model that would point to the smart city deployments, the amount of money by 2025 for UK cities that should be generated by additional consumer spending is £24 billion. And the amount of money that could be available in terms of efficiency gains is £65 billion. So it's certainly not, it's certainly, as Mike has pointed out, enough of a pie for many, many of the players in the market to be going after.
Elizabeth, what might Silicon Valley have to say about this?
Yeah, well, so yes. So traveling back to the West Coast of the US, the company mentality for all of the big players is to own and control as much as you can around the ecosystem of the services that you provide. That's just how these companies think. So Facebook does not contract out to somebody else to run its data centers. It builds its own data centers so that it can build them exactly as they want to build them, creating new kinds of green technology, saying this is how we're going to look after user information and ensure that law enforcement doesn't bother us to keep your data safe. The quip that's currently going around America that some of you might have heard is Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, at home, feeling a little bit hungry and turning to his Alexa device, saying, "Alexa, would you order me something from Whole Foods?" And Alexa replying, "Yes, Jeff, buying Whole Foods." So, whether it's Amazon buying a company like Whole Foods or Facebook building a drone to connect Africa, let's be clear. The idea behind Facebook's drone technology is to sustain its own control over how it's connecting countries that are currently less connected. And as long as Brussels and Washington, D.C. doesn't get in the way, this is how these companies really think. I think back through all of the number of years that Google tried to figure out how to crack the social network code. They still haven't gotten there. But the goal was not to find amazing partnerships with Facebook. The goal was to create their own service. And I don't see that trend changing anytime soon. And sometimes we hear what these companies are buying, and we think, wow, this doesn't make any sense. Why is Facebook buying, WhatsApp? Why are they buying the Oculus Rift technology? But the goal is, of course, behind the scenes to integrate seamlessly the kind of data around the individuals that will help make each product and each service better and to anticipate trends. And I don't think in the West Coast that's going to change anytime soon, as long as it's legal and the trust busters don't do in the model.
Excellent. More questions. Yes, lady at the left-hand side on the aisle there, and gentleman in the middle halfway along here.
Thanks. It's Patricia Lewis here. I think, Elizabeth, in some ways, I'd have loved to have you on my panel later on. That's an advert for the panel later on, actually. But maybe you can stick around and join in from the floor. But I'm very much struck, as we all are, of course, about what happened in Las Vegas. And what we're seeing there is, again, the employment of fake news in the form of false accusations that began immediately. And I direct people here to a Twitter feed called RV Wonk, that's collecting all the false news tweets that are being done. It's quite instructive. I just wanted to look at the business issues over fake news and ask your opinion about where that sort of where the stress lines are over the business cases for doing nothing or doing something. And I wonder how much of it depends on the way platforms see themselves. For example, if they see themselves as publishers, or whether they just see themselves as neutral conduits, or they just see themselves as, we don't really care as long, a bit sort of Ryanair-ish, as long as we make a bit of some money. And so I wonder if, I've always thought of, in some ways, the gold standard for a lot of these platforms are, in fact, as publishers. And they're publishing the thought, they're like huge diaries, aren't they? Fascinating social commentary and history in the making. And so what point does Facebook decide it doesn't want to become the National Enquirer and would prefer to be the London Times in terms of its reputation? And how much would it affect the bottom line if it did that?
Elizabeth.
Great. Well, Patricia, what a fascinating question. And I think what's really interesting with the Las Vegas story the last few days is, we've unfortunately seen in recent years too many of these attacks through our news feeds. But from my perspective, this is really the first time where the predominant story, aside from the event itself, was this fake news strain. This has been going on for a long time, but it wasn't really picked up by the media. And I think that in the wake of Donald Trump and in the wake of the questions around the Russian intelligence, now we're starting to see the story itself being how it is that that fake news has spread. And actually, gesturing over to Charlie on the police side, it was, the police were some of the earliest adopters of really excellent use of Facebook from a public communications perspective. So not, the policing itself, which is not necessarily my territory, but from a public communications perspective in the fake news space, because of the riots in London in 2011. At that moment, the Home Office brought together the communicators of all of the police organizations to actually do a diagnostic and say, of organizations that were using social media, of organizations that were not, what do we learn and how do we get ahead of this? So it's really interesting now that so many years later, this has really come to the fore. Absolutely, the companies have really insisted on not putting themselves into the position of being the publisher. And this has been core to their messaging from the beginning. We're not media companies, we're not publishers, we're just licensed to share your information, has been their stance. And so I talked about the fact that the ecosystem, in terms of the product, it's all about having as much ownership as you can at each phase along the way. But in this element, in terms of the content that's actually on the platform, where the companies do want to collaborate is in that space. So what I'm starting to see is, and here in the UK, when a company like Facebook is looking at terrorism and radicalization, their goal is to say, look, we're partnering with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue to figure this out. Or in America, the News Integrity Project is all about saying we're partnering with these guys to sort out these issues. So it's like they're trying to place a little bit of distance between the more sinister material that's taking place on their platforms and themselves as having responsibility for that kind of information. For anybody who's not currently following the CEOs and the senior management teams of these companies, I really suggest you follow them on their own platforms. Every member, senior representative of a company like a Twitter or a Facebook is using their own product to essentially, share their own firsthand information about what's going on. And that's the best way to get, I think, a firsthand indication of how they're starting to think. So I noticed that the head of law enforcement yesterday, straight out of the box, or 2 days ago, on the Vegas issue, had about a 3-paragraph update directly on Facebook saying, this is what we've decided to do in the wake of the increase of fake news around the Las Vegas issue. So it's a really interesting space to watch, and a changing one as well.
Really interesting. Well, let's move to that next question. Sorry, I left you in the lurch there, but I thought it was important to just carry straight through. But yes, your question, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you. We've heard a lot about smart cities. That's, of course, very exciting. But what opportunities do the panel see for avoiding a cyber urban-rural divide?
Mike, one for you.
Operators who are public licensees have obligations to their national regulator, namely to Ofcom, and we have obligations for coverage. However, the investment goes as deep as the sites that are available, the spectrum that is available, and dare I say it, the demand that might warrant the investment. We invest close to £3 million a day as O2. If we take the mobile business as a whole, probably £10 million a day in the UK, and we can't get the sites we need, we can't get the spectrum we need. With regard to a new divide, if the demand is there, I think that will encourage the investment to go there. But I would also say that we are moving into a world where smart cities might be based much more on neutral hosts. So an example of that might be London Underground has a Virgin Wi-Fi service for all users on the London Underground, and smartphone users have access whether they're on O2 or Vodafone. In cities, we might see more neutral hosts to address the sites problem in cities. We might need to see similar neutral host type solutions in rural areas. That would be helped if public authorities and local authorities released land for that. I sit on the board of Enterprise M3, which covers most of Surrey and Hampshire. One of the key messages we've given for our investment plans recently is no investment unless there is a digital strategy, which could include making available public land. But at the end of the day, the competition policy sits with Ofcom, the release of spectrum is a key ingredient, and the investment has to follow the demand.
Caroline, you live in a rural area where no one can ever even reach you on a mobile phone. What's your...
Yes, what he doesn't realise is that sometimes that's because I've turned it off. But anyway, it's true. I live in rural Yorkshire, and I have very variable coverage from a cellular context and an interesting fixed line provision. So I absolutely, your question really resonates very strongly with me. One of the really interesting dynamics in IoT application areas is this trade-off between pockets of very high demand, which are clearly in consumer IoT predicated around areas of urban density, essentially. So where you've got lots of people living, then you will have high demand for consumer IoT services. And often what you're doing with an IoT application in that context is that you're spreading overstretched service provision more thinly or more efficiently. You're actually making it possible for that service to meet the kind of peaks of usage demand that are being generated. And we see that in transport networks, for example. And we see that in some of the IoT work that's been looking at the consumption of energy across the energy grid. There's some really challenging questions about what happens to our energy grid when we start to adopt electric cars in a more widespread fashion, because actually there are some really big issues about how we're going to be able to all charge our cars up overnight if we have the grid working the way it works today. But when you look at rural deployments of IoT applications, it is certainly not the case that there is a paucity of opportunity for rural deployments of IoT, because actually some of the biggest problems in delivering universal services that come about because of the remoteness or the hard to reach nature or the sparse populations, or the sparser populations of rural inhabitants, are directly helped by the deployment of IoT applications. So if you think, for example, in the context of social care and the provision of services to elderly individuals who need to have chronic conditions monitored, or who need to be able to be supported with services to visit them in their homes and make sure that they're safe and they're healthy, those are services which are really, really hard to address in rural contexts, and which IoT applications and the work that the IoT UK programme is doing, looking at some of those IoT applications, particularly in the context of dementia, and how you use IoT devices to support individuals suffering from dementia and their care groups, so their families, their professional carers, in being able to help those lifestyles to be managed much more flexibly and adaptably, but not in a way which is distressing to the individual. So there are some really interesting areas that I think are important to think about in a rural context, and where we will truly see changes for the better in the way that we can manage the provision of services, which don't only save money, they also actually help the lives of the people for whom those packages are being delivered.
Fantastic optimism. Good to hear it. We've got about 5 minutes left, so a couple more questions. Yes, the gentleman on the left here, and Oh, I can't ask you, Jeremy. You've had too much. Gentleman, just in the middle there, in the third row or so. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Hi there, Sasha Meckler from Analysis Mason. I think this is predominantly for Elizabeth, but others might want to chip in. So the point about IoT is effectively it makes more data available. There are more data endpoints, and one can do and learn more things with the data, which allows for improved systems. Now, I think when talking about the tech giants out of Silicon Valley, I think the problem is not really with them. I think the problem is with the regulation and the legislative systems that were built for an industrial age economy and haven't moved on for an information age economy where you've got mass customization, where you've got the whole concept of prosumers becoming not just something that happens in the digital realm, but is now also happening, for example, in the energy realm and in other areas. And so you have these fundamental institutional aspects of, and they're not in the business realm, they're actually in the social realm and the public realm that are not keeping up. What are you doing to sort of possibly engage with that, or what are the views across the panel that can be done for government and systems to change? And I'll refer back to maybe one other point in my previous question, which was around, with all of this greater amount of data representing everything that's happening in the world, will market-based economies really be the most efficient economies, for example, in the future, or are planned economies actually going to be more efficient as a result that we've got the data and we can do that and apply the benefits in a distributed and digitized way? So I know, a very complex question,
that is a very complex question.
You can answer it from different aspects.
We'll hold that thought, and we'll take the second question, and then we'll go through the panel.
Actually, it's very related. I actually had a question about data as well, but I won't ask it now. So democratization. So Internet of Things is supposed to be cheap and useful for whoever and whatever, but it seems to be targeted to the wealthy, to the able, to the young, ones with disposable income. They're the ones which are interesting to the businesses, to the Facebooks, to the the high-end companies. Whereas the real need is often in social care or in rural environments where there isn't a business model for that, and there's not the money to do it. So where does the democratization come from to enable that as a business, seeing as this is a business section, to do that? Because that's where the need is, not necessarily the want, but that the want is what's being fed.
Excellent. Really good, very interesting pair of questions. Mike, can I turn to you?
Can I take the second question?
Take the second question. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
I'm all in favour of having a cost-effective solution. I think that's vital. But it's actually horses for courses. I think we need to think about what sort of volumes are in play for this. We also don't see the smart home market moving as fast as the smart city market, for example. We also don't see the connected car market moving at the same rate as those two either. So if we were to say, how do we get the cost down? I think we have to look at it sector by sector or domain by domain. But economies of scale will be absolutely vital in this area. So how do we keep the cost of the things down, the cost of the usage down, and the cost of the services arising from that down? And economies of scale, I think, is a key ingredient in that area. It won't, as I said earlier, just be cellular. It'll be a range of technologies. But for the coverage point made earlier on, cellular happens to have the strongest wide area coverage unless you go for a higher cost satellite solution. But if you want an indoor solution, more for the home, you might go for Wi-Fi. So again, it's horses for courses for the different markets, but the economies of scale affect all of those markets. International economies of scale.
Elizabeth, do you want to take the first question, perhaps, and think about how the regulator might respond to massive increase of available data?
Yeah, I'll take pieces of both. Okay, I think, I think a bit on the second question, then I'll go into the first. It's really a difference of the short-term and the long-term bet. Short-term, absolutely. The easy wins are, the people with enough disposable income to spend their money buying this and buying that and using some of these products and services. But long-term, these companies are absolutely betting on other potential sources of revenue. The drone project, Sheryl Sandberg herself has just laughed about this as a chief operating officer. She never should have signed off on that project, really, because the payoff from building this kind of technology is so far down the road. You know, you can't connect people and then expect to see the return on that investment overnight. It's going to take decades for the businesses to build and start producing the kinds of ads that land on a mobile phone to have Facebook actually see the result of that project. So that's just an extremely long-term bet versus the short-term bets, which is a great partnership with Procter & Gamble to sell toothbrushes to to those of us who live in this country, for example. On the first question, I don't know how much time all of you tend to spend in San Francisco, but this conversation is happening a lot in San Francisco right now, which is essentially, how is it possible that the region that attracts so many of the brightest minds in the space where technology improves people's lives can coexist in an environment where the government has become so far out of touch and out of step with this kind of innovation? And that's not to say that it's the government's fault, because the private sector also hasn't figured out how to effectively partner. That, the concept of hopping on the bus and using your contactless cards like we do in this country, I mean, this is not going on San Francisco buses. It's a great city, but you're still handed the little brown transfer pass. It's old school, a lot of San Francisco. And so it's really strange, because you think, my gosh, how is it possible that the tech community and the public sector and the local policymakers haven't figured out how to create a dream scenario? Why is this happening in Dubai, but not in San Francisco? It's very, very interesting right now. And again, it's a fantastic environment, but there are elements of it that really show that these two worlds are not handshaking. And that's exactly what we're doing right now at Chatham House, is we're saying, if we could rebuild the whole suit of technology meets policymaking, what would that look like now? Rather than just say, take out the seam here and there and stitch it up here and there. What about just starting fresh? And so anybody in this room with ideas on bringing those two worlds together, this is really something that we're wanting to address head on, because it needs to be done. And if it's broken and not working in an environment like San Francisco, that to me is just hugely representative of why it would be broken and not working in other environments that are farther and farther away from some of these big hubs and the kinds of places that are hoovering up the tax money that comes out of the Silicon Valley as well.
Fantastic. Charlie, we've got a couple more minutes, so final thoughts from you perhaps on these 2 points?
Yeah, I suppose data, so back to the policing head. Who owns that data? Who's got rights over that data? Who's got the liability around that data? And we see our data being scooped up all over the place. You go through any airport now, your data's firing off left, right and centre. TfL put out in the news, I think yesterday, about they're going to be tracking everyone's movements. Swipe, we just heard about, you tap your phone and that's your Oyster card and everything's now in your wallet on your phone. But where does that data ultimately end up, and who's going to monetize that data? It makes sense, make money out of it. Then you can make the end product actually, rather than scaling up, make the end product that's deployed in the first place cheaper or benefits back to the consumer. To a certain degree, there's also concerns around that with, the liability of the data and how it's then shared on further and further and further down the food chain, and you lose control over how it's being shared and why it's being shared and why it's being retained and not destroyed when it's not appropriate to still retain it. Obvious example for me was when I was law enforcement and we were sharing data with one of our government bodies. That government body then shared that data on to umpteen other organisations, where it ended up in the charity arena for some weird and completely inappropriate purpose. Just on the need not want around making these consumables cheaper, so that everybody can benefit and everybody can purchase them. Just a word of warning, you know, scaling up does make them cheaper, but also, you know, releasing the IP and the Chinese version or the fraudulent version, counterfeit version that is available online is also cheaper. So there's a danger factor with some of these as well. And we haven't really looked at, you know, IoT, the fake side. I always end up with a doom and gloom, sorry. The fake side, the dangerous side, that is the cheaper side that, you know, sometimes enables those less fortunate, the more rural, remote areas that perhaps need it most. So, and that ties back in, I go full circle to, you know, how do we actually know that it's fit for purpose, that it does what it says on the tin when we get that IoT device? And what standards are actually being checked and validated around it.
Excellent. I think we are absolutely out of time, so I'm going to stop there. Just suffice to say that it's very good to know that in some context or other, London is rather ahead of San Francisco, even if it's only as far as the bus tickets are concerned. Anyway, it's an excellent panel. Thank you very much to Mike and Elizabeth and Charlie and Caroline. Thank you very much.